You are standing in a field roughly 5,000 years ago in what is now eastern Turkey. You are holding a rock. It is sharp, chipped carefully into a point, and it is the best weapon you have ever owned. The man across from you is holding something you have never seen before. It is long, thin, metallic, and it catches the light in a way that stone never does. You do not know what it is. You do not know how it was made. You do not even know what it is made of. But you understand immediately, instinctively, that the person holding that object has a reach advantage you cannot overcome, a speed you cannot match, and a material that will not shatter on impact the way yours will. That single moment, that first encounter between stone and metal, between the world that came before and the world that came after, is one of the most consequential technological transitions in the entire history of human violence. And it started not because someone wanted a better weapon, but because someone figured out how to melt a rock. So how did we get from sharpened stones to forged steel? The answer stretches across 5,000 years, 3 continents, and at least 4 completely independent metallurgical traditions. And it begins with a problem that stone could never solve. Let's start with what people were actually fighting with before metal existed, because the weapons that came before the sword explain exactly why the sword had to be invented. For roughly 2.5 million years, every cutting tool humans ever made was stone. Flint, chert, obsidian. And honestly, they were remarkably good. Obsidian, volcanic glass, fractures into edges as thin as 3 nanometers. To put that in perspective, a modern surgical steel scalpel has an edge roughly 25,000 nanometers thick. Under an electron microscope, a steel blade looks jagged and ragged. An obsidian blade looks like a single unbroken line. Obsidian scalpels have actually been used in modern experimental surgeries because they can slice between individual cells instead of tearing through them. So why would anyone bother replacing something that sharp? Because stone has a fatal flaw. It is brittle. You can make it sharper than any metal, but you cannot make it long and thin without it snapping. A flint dagger works. A flint sword is physically impossible. The material cannot do it. Every stone blade ever made was limited by the same constraint. The longer you make it, the more likely it is to break. And in combat, reach is everything. The person with the longer weapon controls the distance. The person who controls the distance controls the fight. And for 2.5 million years, nobody could solve that problem because the material itself said no. Metal said yes. Sometime around 9,000 years ago, people in various parts of the Near East started picking up chunks of native copper, metal that occurred naturally in pure form near the surface, and hammering them into shapes. Ornaments mostly. Small tools. The copper was soft, too soft to hold a real edge, and it bent easily. Not exactly the material you would trust your life to in a fight, but it had one property that stone did not. You could heat it. You could melt it. You could pour it into a mold and cast it into whatever shape you wanted, including shapes that stone could never hold. And then someone, somewhere, probably by accident, mixed copper with arsenic. And the resulting alloy was harder. It held an edge longer. It could be cast into blades that were longer and thinner than pure copper allowed. This is where the oldest known swords enter the story. In the early 1980s, Professor Marcella Frangipane of Sapienza University of Rome was excavating a site called Arslan Tepe, a monumental mound in the Malatya province of eastern Turkey. Inside the remains of what had been a palace complex, her team found a cache of 9 weapons. 3 short swords and 6 long daggers made of arsenical copper alloy, with blades measuring 45 to 60 centimeters long. They had blades, guards, grips, and pommels. Every element of what we recognize as sword design was already present. 3 of them were inlaid with silver. These were not crude experimental prototypes. These were refined, carefully made weapons that clearly belonged to people of high status. They are roughly 5,300 years old. Before Arslan Tepe, most historians dated the first swords to around 1600 or 1500 BCE. Frangipane's discovery pushed that date back by more than 1,500 years. which means that somewhere in Anatolia or the Caucasus, there was already a sophisticated metalworking tradition producing real swords, while most of the world was still using stone. But here's the thing about those early metal blades. Copper and arsenical copper are not great sword materials. They are soft. A long blade bends. A long blade that bends in the middle of a fight is a problem, specifically the kind of problem that gets you killed. And this is where tin changes everything. Mix copper with about 10% tin, and you get bronze. Bronze is harder than pure copper, significantly harder. It holds an edge better. It can be cast into complex shapes, and it is tough enough to make long blades that do not fold over the first time they hit something solid. Bronze is the material that made the sword a real weapon, not just a status symbol for a rich man's wall. The Egyptian khopesh is probably the most recognizable bronze sword in history. It evolved from earlier Mesopotamian sickle swords and, before that, from crescent-shaped battle axes. The earliest representations show up on the stele of the vultures around 2500 BCE, but the khopesh reached its peak during the Egyptian New Kingdom, roughly 1570 to 1070 BCE. That forward-curving blade was not decorative. The hook could catch and pull away an opponent's shield, opening a gap for the killing stroke. It was devastatingly effective in chariot warfare, where speed and the ability to strike while passing made a curved hooking blade far more useful than a straight one. 2 khopeshis were found in Tutankhamun's tomb, not buried as decorations, buried as symbols of pharaonic power. But bronze had its own fatal dependency. And this is where the story of swords becomes inseparable from the story of global trade. Bronze requires tin. Copper was relatively accessible, especially from Cyprus. But tin is geologically rare and unevenly distributed across the Earth's surface. The nearest major tin sources to the ancient Near East were in Afghanistan, Central Asia, Cornwall, in Britain, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula. Recent geochemical studies using trace element and isotope analysis have confirmed that tin from Cornwall reached the Mediterranean as early as the 2nd millennium BCE. British tin has been found in shipwrecks dating to 1300 BCE off the coast of Israel. Think about that. 3,000 years ago, a supply chain stretched from the mines of southwestern England to the forges of the eastern Mediterranean just so people could make swords. In 1982, a shipwreck was discovered off the coast of Kos, Turkey, the Uluburun wreck, a late Bronze Age merchant vessel that sank in the late 14th century BCE. It was carrying copper and tin ingots, glass, luxury goods, and 2 Mycenaean bronze swords. One ship, sitting on the bottom of the Mediterranean for over 3,000 years, carrying the raw ingredients and the finished products of the Bronze Age weapons industry in the same hull. It told archaeologists more about how interconnected the ancient world actually was than decades of land-based excavation. And then that entire system collapsed. Around 1200 BCE, a cascading series of disasters hit the eastern Mediterranean. Climate change, drought, trade disruptions, internal rebellions, and the mysterious Sea Peoples, a coalition of maritime raiders whose identity historians still argue about. The city of Ugarit, a vital node in the international tin trade, was destroyed around 1180 to 1190 BCE. When the tin trade routes collapsed, the ability to produce bronze weapons collapsed with them. And without bronze weapons, the military power that depended on them collapsed too. Dominoes, falling across an entire civilization. But here is something most people get wrong about what happened next. Iron did not replace bronze because iron was better. Early iron was often worse than high-quality bronze. It was softer, harder to work, and more likely to rust. Iron replaced bronze because iron ore is everywhere. It is one of the most abundant elements in the Earth's crust. You did not need a trade route stretching from Cornwall to the Levant to get your hands on iron. You could find it in your own backyard. And that changed everything, because now you did not need to be wealthy to arm yourself. You did not need access to a global supply chain. Iron democratized the sword the way the printing press would later democratize the book. Think about what that actually means for warfare. During the Bronze Age, swords were expensive. They were owned by a warrior elite, men who could afford the rare materials and the skilled craftsmen. Most people, the farmers, the laborers, the ordinary people who made up the vast majority of any ancient population, still fought with stone tools or simple wooden weapons. War was something that belonged to the wealthy. Iron changed that equation permanently. When the raw material for a weapon is sitting in the hillside behind your village, suddenly everyone can be armed. Armies got bigger. Wars got bloodier. The individual champion with his expensive bronze sword and his personal reputation mattered less. The massed infantry formation, rows of ordinary men with ordinary iron swords, mattered more. It was the same shift that would happen again and again throughout history, the same pattern. Make a weapon cheaper, and the structure of warfare changes around it. Not because the weapon is better, but because more people can carry one. And while we are talking about iron, let's talk about the strangest iron blade ever found. In 1925, Howard Carter was carefully unwrapping the mummy of Tutankhamun when he found 2 daggers in the wrappings, one gold, one iron. In 2016, Italian and Egyptian researchers used X-ray fluorescence spectrometry to analyze that iron blade and found it contained roughly 11% nickel and 0.6% cobalt. That is the chemical signature of meteoritic iron. The blade was matched to the Karga meteorite, found near Mersa Matruh. The ancient Egyptians had a name for this material. They called it iron of the sky. They literally took a rock that fell from space and turned it into a dagger for a dead king. That is approximately 3,300 years of human ambition summarized in a single object. Now, iron by itself is still not great for swords. It is too soft. But add a small amount of carbon, between about 0.5 and 1.5%, and iron becomes steel. And steel changes the equation completely. Harder than bronze. Flexible enough not to snap, capable of holding an edge that stays sharp through sustained combat. The question is how you get the carbon in there. In India, they figured it out first. Sometime in the mid-1st millennium BCE, metal workers in southern India developed a process called crucible steel. They packed iron ore with carbon-rich materials, wood chips, specific leaves, and sealed the mixture inside clay crucibles. Then they heated those crucibles to temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius. The result was a steel with unusually high carbon content, between 1.0 and 1.6%, and an internal crystalline structure that, when forged correctly, produced visible patterns on the blade surface. The Indian word for this steel, uruku in Tamil, ukku in Kannada and Telugu, was anglicized by Europeans into woots. And woots steel ingots were exported along ancient trade routes to Persia and Syria, where Persian and Arab bladesmiths forged them into the weapons the Western world would come to call Damascus swords. The name came from the marketplace where Europeans first encountered them, not from where the steel actually originated. The watered flowing patterns on a true Damascus blade are not applied or etched on. They are an inherent feature of the steel's internal carbide banding structure, visible only after careful etching with acid. The secret to making woot steel was largely lost by around 1750, disrupted during the colonial period. But before it disappeared, it left a mark. Alexander the Great reportedly brought 10 kilograms of Indian woots steel back from his campaigns, reportedly stunned by its quality. And centuries later, Michael Faraday, the physicist, studied Indian steel ingots in his laboratory. His investigations helped lay the groundwork for modern materials science. A failed attempt to reverse engineer an ancient sword ended up founding an entire scientific discipline. On the other side of the world, Chinese metallurgists were solving the same problem by completely different means. In 1965, archaeologists excavating a tomb in Jingzhou, Hubei province, opened a nearly airtight wooden casket and found a bronze sword. It belonged to Gojian, king of Yue. who reigned from 496 to 465 BCE. The sword was over 2,500 years old. It was untarnished, and when they tested it, it cut cleanly through 20 sheets of paper. The secret was a bimetallic design. The core of the blade was copper-rich bronze, flexible enough not to snap. The cutting edges had a higher tin content, making them harder and sharper. 2 different alloys in a single weapon, each doing a different job. That level of metallurgical sophistication, 2,500 years ago, in a culture that was also independently developing cast iron and steel, tells you that the story of the sword is not a single story. It is multiple stories happening simultaneously on different continents with different materials and different solutions, all converging on the same basic problem. How do you make a blade that is hard enough to cut, tough enough not to break, and long enough to keep the other person's blade away from your throat? Back in Europe, the Romans answered that question not with metallurgical innovation, but with design philosophy. The Roman gladius was short, roughly 60 to 68 centimeters. By the standards of Celtic and Germanic swords, it was almost laughably small. Celtic latene swords, 70 to 90 centimeters of broad, iron blade, were designed for sweeping, powerful slashes by individual warriors fighting in loose formations. They were impressive weapons for impressive fighters, and the Romans beat them repeatedly with a sword that was basically a large kitchen knife. Because the gladius was not designed for individual combat, it was designed for formations. Tight, disciplined, shield wall formations where the soldier in front of you was so close you could smell his breath. In that environment, a long slashing sword is useless. You cannot swing it. There is no room. What you need is a short, fast, stabbing weapon that you can thrust past the edge of your shield into the man standing directly in front of you. The gladius was that weapon. It was an industrial tool for organized killing, optimized not for the heroic duel, but for the grinding, unglamorous business of close-order infantry combat. The Romans originally adopted the design from the Celtiberian warriors of the Iberian Peninsula, who used a similar short sword called the gladius hispaniensis. The irony is significant. Rome took a sword concept from one group of people and used it to conquer most of the known world, including the descendants of the people who invented it. But warfare changes, and the gladius changed with it. By the 3rd century CE, Roman armies were fighting differently. More cavalry, more mobile engagements. Enemies who fought in looser formations at greater distances. The short gladius was losing its edge, literally and figuratively. So the Romans adopted the spatha, a longer sword, 75 to 100 centimeters, directly influenced by the Celtic and Germanic long swords they had been fighting against for centuries. The spatha gave cavalry the reach they needed and gave infantry versatility against enemies who did not stand in neat rows waiting to be stabbed. And that spatha, that longer Roman sword born from contact with Northern European blade traditions, became the direct ancestor of every medieval European sword that followed. Viking swords, Norman swords, Crusader swords. Every one of them traces its lineage back to a Roman weapon that was itself borrowed from Celtic enemies. The sword, it turns out, migrated as readily as any other idea. In Japan, swordsmiths answered the hard versus tough question with what might be the most labor-intensive bladesmithing process ever devised, the katana. Forged from tamahagane, a steel produced in clay furnaces called tatara from iron sand and charcoal, the raw material contained wildly uneven carbon levels and impurities. The famous folding technique was not magic. It was a necessary metallurgical solution. Folding homogenized the carbon distribution, preventing brittle weak spots. It worked out slag and impurities, and it created the layered grain structure visible on the finished blade. Then came differential hardening. The smith coated the blade in clay, thicker along the spine, thinner along the edge, and quenched it in water. The thin-coated edge cooled rapidly, becoming extremely hard. The thick-coated spine cooled slowly, remaining flexible. The result was a blade that was hard where it needed to cut and resilient where it needed to absorb shock. And the visible line where those two zones meet, the Heiman, became one of the most celebrated aesthetic features in the history of weapon design. Japan's greatest swordsmith, Masamune, forged a blade called the Honjo Masamune that became a symbol of the Tokugawa shogunate itself. After World War II, it was handed to an American soldier, and then it vanished. Nobody knows where it is. One of the most important swords in Japanese history is right now simply gone. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Vikings were carrying swords inscribed with the word VLFBERHT. These Ulfbert swords produced between the 9th and 11th centuries were made from crucible steel with extremely low slag content, steel that European furnaces at the time could not have produced. The metal almost certainly came from Central Asia, or the Islamic world, imported along the Volga trade route that connected Scandinavia to the Caspian Sea. Ulfbert was not one smith. It was a brand, a prestigious workshop name stamped on blades for over 200 years. And because the name carried such value, counterfeiters made copies. Fakes using inferior local bloomery iron, brittle enough to shatter in combat, killing the man who paid good money for a sword he thought he could trust. Archaeologists can tell the fakes from the originals by the steel quality and occasionally by misspellings in the inscription. An ancient quality control problem solved by metallurgical analysis 1,000 years later. Here is something else most people get wrong about medieval swords. They were not heavy. A standard one-handed medieval sword weighed between 2.5 and 3.5 pounds, roughly the weight of a laptop. These were precision instruments, not crude bludgeons, and the people wielding them were not flailing wildly. Medieval fighting manuals, Fechtbücher, written by masters like Johannes Lichtenauer in Germany and Fiore de Liberi in Italy, describe sophisticated martial arts systems with named techniques, precise footwork, and counter moves. Half-swording, gripping the blade with one gloved hand to guide the point into gaps in plate armor. The Mordschlag, flipping the sword around and using the crossguard as a hammer against a fully armored opponent. These were trained, systematic fighting methods, not the chaotic hacking you see in movies. And the groove running along many medieval blades, that is called a fuller. It is not a blood groove. It has nothing to do with blood. It is a structural feature that reduces the blade's weight while maintaining rigidity. Exactly the same engineering principle as an I-beam in a skyscraper. Someone figured out structural engineering and applied it to a sword. They just did not call it that, and then the sword died. Not suddenly, slowly. The same way most dominant technologies die, not because something replaced them directly, but because the world changed around them in ways that made them less and less relevant. First, armor improved. By the late Middle Ages, steel plate armor had gotten so effective that traditional cutting swords were nearly useless against it. Swordsmiths responded with thrusting swords like the estoc, which had no cutting edge at all, just a stiff, narrow blade designed to punch through gaps in plate. And with techniques like the Mordschlag, when you're using your sword as a hammer, that is a weapon admitting its original purpose no longer works. Then came massed pike formations. Dense blocks of infantry carrying long spears, often 15 to 18 feet long. Against a wall of pike points, a sword was a liability. The sword had become a sidearm, not a primary weapon, long before guns arrived. And then the bayonet. Introduced in the late 17th century, the socket bayonet turned every musket into both a ranged weapon and a spear. In a single stroke, it eliminated the need for dedicated pikemen and made the sword redundant for infantry combat. The sword survived as a cavalry weapon and an officer's sidearm for another 2 centuries, but its days as a decisive battlefield tool were over. George S. Patton, before he became famous for commanding tanks across Europe, designed what might be the last serious military sword ever made. The Model 1913 cavalry saber, sometimes called the Patton saber, was built specifically for thrusting rather than slashing, because Patton believed that was the only way a sword could remain relevant against modern opponents. It was a final, earnest attempt to modernize a weapon that had already been outpaced by history. The fact that the man who designed it would later abandon horses entirely in favor of armored vehicles tells you everything about where the sword stood by the 20th century. The last major cavalry charge with drawn sabers happened on August 23, 1942. The Italian Savoia Cavalleria, roughly 600 men, charged Soviet infantry positions at the Battle of Izbesenskij on the Eastern Front. With sabers and hand grenades, they overran 2,000 Soviet soldiers armed with machine guns and mortars, and they won. In 1942, charging with swords against automatic weapons. It worked exactly once more in a world that had already moved on. A closing parenthesis on 5,000 years of history. In June 2023, archaeologists working in Nordlingen, Bavaria, pulled a bronze sword from a burial site containing 3 skeletons, a man, a woman, and a boy. The sword was roughly 3,000 years old. It had an octagonal bronze hilt, cast directly over the blade using a technique called overlay casting that required extraordinary skill. Officials from the Bavarian State Office for the Preservation of Monuments said the weapon almost still shines. Despite being buried for 3 millennia, the blade showed no signs of use in combat, but analysis of its center of gravity confirmed it was a functional weapon, not ceremonial. 3,000 years underground. And it was still in some fundamental sense ready tonight somewhere. There is a sword hanging on a wall, maybe in a museum behind glass, maybe in a collector's home, maybe in a military officer's dress uniform, polished and ceremonial, carried for tradition rather than threat. It does not cut anything anymore. It does not need to. But the problem it solved, how to project lethal force further than your arm can reach, how to concentrate cutting energy along a thin edge, how to combine hardness and flexibility in a single object. Those problems shaped metallurgy, chemistry, global trade networks, martial arts architecture, and the political structure of nearly every civilization that ever carried one. The sword is a piece of bent metal. It is also 5,000 years of human ingenuity compressed into something you can hold in one hand. And the people who made the first ones in that palace workshop in eastern Turkey, shaping arsenical copper into something the world had never seen, they could not have known what they were starting. They just knew that stone breaks and metal bends, and the person with the longer blade goes home.